Seraphina needed to move quickly, secure water from the frozen creek, gather the last dry kindling before the storm hit, and bar herself inside the cabin before nightfall. 3 months hiding in the thornwood, and still the approaching winter filled her with dread that gnawed at her bones. Each dawn brought sharper cold. Each sunset arrived earlier, shrinking her world to the space between survival and surrender. But then a sound pierced the howling wind, so desperate, so terrified, she nearly mistook it for her own fears given voice. She stopped, ice-crusted bucket trembling in her grip. There again a high, keening cry that tore through the storm like a blade. Seraphina turned toward the swollen creek, squinting against snow that bit her exposed skin. The winter melt had transformed the gentle stream into a churning torrent, angry and gray beneath the darkening sky. There, halfway across the flood, caught against a half-submerged log, a small dark shape struggled against the current. A wolf pup, no larger than a hare, its sodden fur barely distinguishable from the driftwood. As she watched, the creature scrambled for purchase on the slick wood, tiny claws scraping uselessly. It slipped, plunged shoulder-deep into the icy water, then hauled itself back up with a desperate lunge. Another cry, weaker this time. "Where is your pack?" Seraphina whispered, searching the opposite shore with rising panic. The forest stood empty, no adult wolves in sight. Just the pup, alone and dying as the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. The choice before her was brutally simple: turn away, return to her inadequate shelter. She had barely enough provisions to sustain herself through the coming months. Winter in the thornwood would be merciless enough without risking her life for a creature whose pack had already abandoned it. The wolves of these woods were not her responsibility, they were predators who would just as soon tear her apart. Yet her feet remained rooted to the frozen ground, watching as those frightened amber eyes found hers across the churning water. The log shuddered. The current was relentless. It wouldn't hold much longer. "Foolish, foolish woman," Seraphina breathed, already dropping her bucket and reaching for her cloak's clasp with numb fingers. She stripped off her outer layers with shaking hands, folding them hastily atop a boulder to keep them dry. The wind cut through her thin wool dress like knives. Lady Seraphina of House Varus, once accustomed to silk and velvet, to servants who heated her bathwater and stoked her fires, now stood barefoot on a frozen creek bank, preparing to plunge into water that could stop her heart. Better a quick death in honest cold than the slow horror that awaited if Alpha King Draeven's hunters found her. The first step into the creek drove the air from her lungs in a shocked gasp. Ice water, fed by mountain snowmelt, swallowed her feet, then her calves, stealing sensation with greedy efficiency. Her dress grew heavy immediately, fabric drinking in water, fighting every forward step. "Stay still," she called to the pup, though she knew it couldn't understand. "Please just hold on." The stones beneath her feet shifted treacherously. The current pulled at her waist now, insistent as grasping hands. One misstep, one slip, and she would join the pup, or worse, be swept downstream to drown alone in the gathering dark. The log lurched. The pup scrabbled frantically, losing ground, its cries growing weaker. Almost there. Seraphina gasped through chattering teeth, each breath a shard of ice in her chest. 5 more steps. 4. 3. Her fingers closed around rough, frozen bark. The pup cowered at her approach, lips pulling back from needle-sharp teeth in a desperate attempt at threat. Its eyes were wild with terror and exhaustion. "Hush now," she whispered, gentle, despite the cold that was stealing her ability to think. "I won't hurt you. Let me help you." Something in her voice, or perhaps simple surrender, made the tiny creature still as she reached for it. Its body was shockingly light as she lifted it from the log, all fragile bones and waterlogged fur. She cradled it against her chest, pressing it close, feeling its frantic heartbeat hammer against her own. The return journey stretched endlessly. Her legs moved like lead, the current stronger now. Hungrier. Each step required a conscious decision not to let the water win. When her foot finally touched the muddy bank, relief crashed through her so powerfully she nearly collapsed. She stood gasping in the shallows for several heartbeats, then forced herself up onto solid ground. Her fingers were blue-white, useless as she fumbled for her cloak. Blood smeared her skin where the pup's cut paw had pressed against her. She wrapped them both in her cloak, tucking the shivering creature inside her dress against her heart. "You're safe now," Seraphina murmured, gathering her scattered belongings with clumsy hands. "I have a fire waiting. Not much food, but enough to share." The pup nestled closer, seeking her warmth with desperate instinct. For the first time in 3 months of lonely exile, the weight of another living creature against her chest made Seraphina's isolation feel less like a fortress and more like a prison she'd built for herself. Thunder rolled across the mountains. The storm was nearly upon them. She hurried through the darkening forest, following a path she'd memorized through careful repetition. The cabin was close, just beyond the stand of ancient pines whose branches groaned under gathering snow. Lightning split the sky, momentarily turning night to harsh white day. In that frozen instant, Seraphina saw them. Shadows that were not shadows, shapes too large to be trees, too still to be wind-bent branches. Dozens of eyes reflecting the lightning's flash, amber and green and ice blue, watching from the darkness between the trees. Wolves, an entire pack, circling her position in perfect, predatory silence. Thunder followed, and darkness crashed back down like a curtain falling. When her vision adjusted, the forest stood empty again. Only falling snow and the creak of branches. Only her ragged breathing and the soft whimper of the pup pressed against her heart. But she could feel them still, watching, waiting. Seraphina ran. The cabin door had never looked more welcoming. She burst through it, slammed it shut, dropped the bar across with shaking hands. Only then did she allow herself to collapse against the rough wood, sliding down until she sat in a puddle of melted snow and creek water. The pup squirmed in her arms. She looked down at it, truly looked, and felt her breath catch. Its eyes, now that fear had faded slightly, gleamed with an intelligence that seemed impossibly human, as though this creature understood every word she'd spoken, every choice she'd made, as though it had been waiting for someone exactly like her to be foolish enough, compassionate enough, to risk everything for a stranger's life. "What have I done?" Seraphina whispered. The pup made a sound almost like a purr and licked her fingers with a rough, warm tongue. Outside, the storm unleashed its fury. Wind screamed around the cabin's corners. Snow began to pile against the door. But beneath the storm's rage, another sound emerged, long, low, and unmistakable. Howling. Not one wolf, but many. Their voices braiding together in a song that raised every hair on Seraphina's body. It wasn't a hunting cry or a threat. It sounded almost like recognition, like acknowledgement, like gratitude. Seraphina fed the fire with trembling hands, dried herself and the pup as best she could, and tried to convince herself that saving one small life hadn't just changed everything. But when dawn came and she peered through the cabin's frost-rimmed window, she knew the truth. There, arranged in a perfect circle around her tiny sanctuary, sat dozens of wolves. They made no sound, showed no aggression. They simply watched and waited, as though standing guard. And at the center of their formation, largest of them all, sat a magnificent silver-black wolf whose eyes gleamed the exact color of a frozen winter sky. Eyes that held far too much understanding to belong to any ordinary beast. As Seraphina's gaze met his, the great wolf lowered his head in what could only be a bow. Then he rose, turned, and vanished into the forest. The others followed, flowing between the trees like smoke, until the clearing stood empty once more. Empty, except for the massive winter stag that now lay at her threshold, its neck cleanly broken, steam still rising from its body in the cold morning air. A gift, a tribute, a promise. Seraphina's hand flew to her mouth. The old stories, the ones she'd dismissed as superstition and fantasy, whispered through her memory with new and terrifying clarity. Shapeshifters, skin changers, the wild ones who walked as both man and wolf. They were real, and she had just saved the child of their prince. When survival demands, you trust the very creatures that could destroy you. Would you take the risk? Drop a comment below. What would you do if you woke to find wolves standing guard at your door? And subscribe so you don't miss what happens next in this forbidden bond between woman and wolf. The stag was real. Seraphina stood in her doorway as pale dawn light filtered through the pines, staring at the massive carcass that steamed in the frigid air. Not a fever dream born of hypothermia. Not a hallucination conjured by 3 months of desperate solitude. Real antlers, real blood darkening the snow, real meat that could mean the difference between surviving winter and becoming another nameless corpse the spring thaw would reveal. Her hands still shook from yesterday's cold as she retrieved her father's hunting knife from inside the cabin. The blade had been her sole inheritance. Taken in haste the night she fled House Varys and the claiming ceremony that would have bound her to a king who murdered his wives. She'd never imagined she would need to know how to use it. Thank the old gods her gamekeeper had been a patient teacher before she'd been imprisoned in silk and expectations. The work was brutal, methodical, necessary. She skinned the stag first, peeling back the hide in careful sections, revealing dark red muscle beneath. The pelt would provide warmth her threadbare blankets could not. Each cut required precision, waste nothing. Honor the gift. Because that's what this was, she realized as her blade separated meat from bone. Not random fortune, a gift, deliberately given. By a wolf who was not entirely wolf. The sensation of being watched crept over her skin like frost. Seraphina's knife paused mid-stroke, but she didn't look up. Not yet. She'd learned in these woods that showing fear invited testing, and she could afford neither fight nor flight. So she continued working, quartering the haunch with steady hands despite the prickling awareness that traveled her spine like fingertips. She carved strips of venison thin enough to dry by the fire, packed the choicest cuts in snow to keep them frozen, buried the offal far from the cabin to avoid drawing scavengers, though she suspected nothing would dare approach while those unseen eyes kept their vigil. The sun tracked across the winter sky, and still she felt the weight of that attention pressing against her shoulders, constant as gravity. By the time dusk bled violet and gold across the snow, Seraphina's arms ached and her dress was stained rust-red with blood. She drove her knife into the chopping stump, and finally, deliberately, lifted her gaze to the tree line. He stood exactly where she'd known he would be. The silver-black wolf was larger in daylight than memory had painted him massive across the chest. His fur rippling mercury and shadow in the dying light. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. Ice blue and utterly focused, holding an intelligence that was distinctly, impossibly human. Not the blank stare of an animal, but the measured assessment of a thinking creature who understood precisely what he was doing. Who understood what she was doing. Seraphina straightened slowly, blood drying on her hands, and met that ancient gaze across the clearing. Woman and wolf. Prey and predator. The space between them hummed with something she had no words for recognition, perhaps. Or the beginning of understanding that what had started with a drowning pup had set in motion something far larger than mercy. She should be terrified. This creature could cross the distance between them in heartbeats, tear out her throat before she could scream. Instead, she dipped her head in acknowledgement. Thank you. The wolf's ears swiveled forward. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, with impossible grace, he lowered himself to the snow, not quite a bow, but unmistakably an answer. You're welcome. When Seraphina blinked, he was gone, melted back into the forest like smoke, but the air still vibrated with his presence, and she knew with absolute certainty that he would return. Seraphina just crossed a line that can't be uncrossed, acknowledging a creature that's both predator and protector. Have you ever felt drawn to something dangerous? Tell me in the comments what you think happens next between the lady and the wolf. Subscribe now because their story is about to get even more intense. He came the next evening as a man. Seraphina saw him through the cabin's frost-rimmed window, tall and powerfully built, moving through the dusk with a predator's fluid grace. He wore only rough leather breeches despite the bitter cold, his bare chest marked with scars that looked like claw marks. Long dark hair fell past his shoulders, and when he turned toward the cabin, those same ice-blue eyes found hers with unnerving precision. She opened the door before fear could stop her. He stood at the edge of the clearing, 3 rabbits dangling from one hand, their necks cleanly broken. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, this wild creature who wore human skin like an ill-fitting coat, and the noblewoman who'd forgotten what it meant to trust another living soul. Then he stepped forward and laid the rabbits on her threshold, exactly where the stag had been. "Thank you," Seraphina said softly, touching her chest, then gesturing to him. His eyes tracked the movement with absolute focus. His lips formed the sounds clumsily. "Dan. K. You." Something in her chest loosened. "Yes, thank you." The pattern established itself over the following weeks. He came always at dusk, sometimes carrying split firewood stacked in his arms with impossible ease, sometimes bearing smooth river stones in shades of blue and grey that he'd arrange on her windowsill while she pretended not to watch. Once, he brought her a winter hare, already skinned, and she understood he'd been observing her struggles with the work. Seraphina began leaving things out: a wooden bowl of water, portions of cooked venison seasoned with precious herbs. He would sit at the forest's edge and eat with his fingers, never taking his eyes from her as she moved about her small domain. She taught him words the way her governess had once taught her languages. "Fire," she said, pointing to the hearth. "Water. Safe. Home." He learned with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Fire. Water. Safe." His voice was rough, unpracticed, as though human speech required muscles he'd forgotten how to use. But when he said home, while looking directly at her, the word carried weight beyond simple definition. One evening, as the first true snowstorm of winter gathered in bruised clouds overhead, Seraphina brought out the duskin she'd been working. She'd measured him by sight alone, the breadth of his shoulders, the length of his arms, and cut a tunic that might keep the cold from his skin. "For you," she said, holding it out, "warm." He approached slowly, like something half-wild testing the boundaries of domestication. When his fingers brushed hers taking the garment, he went utterly still. The contact lasted only a heartbeat. But Seraphina felt it like lightning, the heat of his skin, the tremor that ran through his powerful frame, the way his pupils dilated until his eyes were more black than blue. She stepped back. He remained frozen, the tunic clutched in his hands, staring at her with an intensity that should have terrified her. Instead, her heart raced for entirely different reasons. "Kaelin," he said suddenly, the word emerging like a confession. He pressed his free hand to his chest. Kai. Len. His name. He was giving her his name. "Seraphina," she whispered back, mirroring the gesture. He repeated it perfectly, as though he'd been practicing in the silence between their meetings. Seraphina. The way he shaped her name, reverent, careful, like something precious he was afraid to break, made her breath catch. The next night, he arrived carrying something cupped in both hands, treating it with a care usually reserved for fragile things. When he opened his palms, silvery light spilled across the snow. A flower, but not like any Seraphina had ever seen. Its petals gleamed translucent white, veined with luminescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. The air around it shimmered with soft radiance, and even in the winter cold, warmth emanated from its delicate form. Starbloom, Seraphina breathed, recognition flooding through her. The legendary flower from old stories, said to bloom only in moonlight in the deepest parts of the forest, where magic still ran strong in the earth. Kaelin placed it gently in her hands, and this time when their skin met, he didn't pull away. The yarrow grew near the frozen creek, its dried stalk still holding the potent leaves she needed for poultices. Seraphina knelt carefully on the ice-slick bank, her gathering basket already half full with wintergreen and willow bark. The morning air bit at her exposed skin, but the work kept her warm, kept her focused on something beyond the confusing tangle of feelings Kaelin stirred in her chest. She didn't hear them until it was too late. There. The voice cut through the forest's silence like a blade. Lady Seraphina of House Varus. At last. Seraphina's blood turned to ice. She spun, yarrow falling from her fingers, and saw them emerging from the trees, 4 men in the dark leathers of the Alpha King's elite hunters. Their faces hard with purpose and winter travel. She ran. Her basket tumbled into the snow as she bolted along the creek bank, heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, boots crunched through ice and dead leaves, gaining fast. The cabin was too far. The forest offered no shelter from men who hunted for a living. Her foot hit a patch of black ice hidden beneath fresh snow. The world tilted. Seraphina's ankle twisted with a sickening wrench as she went down hard, crying out as pain shot up her leg. She tried to rise, to crawl, but rough hands seized her arms and hauled her upright. "Easy now, my lady." Commander Thorne's scarred face filled her vision, his breath steaming in the cold air. "The Alpha King has been most concerned about your disappearance." "Let me go." Seraphina struggled, but her injured ankle couldn't bear weight, and Thorne's grip was iron. "Can't do that." Another hunter moved closer, binding rope in his hands. "You made vows, Lady Seraphina." "Claiming vows to the Alpha King himself. Time to honor them." "He murders his wives." The words tore from her throat. "Every woman he claims dies within a year." "Careful." Thorne's voice dropped to something dangerous. "That's treason you're speaking." The hunter with the rope reached for her wrists. A sound split the air, something between a roar and a howl that raised every hair on Seraphina's body. The hunters froze, hands moving to weapons. Then Kaelin was there. He came from the trees like vengeance given form, massive and silver black, his wolf body a blur of fur and fangs. He hit the first hunter with enough force to crack ribs, sending the man flying into a tree trunk. The second hunter drew a blade, but Kaelin was already moving, jaws closing around the man's sword arm with surgical precision. Thorne released Seraphina and drew his own weapon, a long hunting knife that gleamed with something other than steel. Silver, she realized with dawning horror. Silver that could kill a shifter. Kaelin lunged. Thorne was fast, but not fast enough. The blade scored across Kaelin's shoulder instead of finding his heart. Blood, impossibly red against winter white, spattered the snow. The wolf didn't slow. He drove into Thorne with snarling fury, and the commander ran, shouting for his men to retreat. They fled into the forest, leaving only blood and scattered weapons behind. Silence fell, broken only by Seraphina's ragged breathing and the soft sound of transformation. Kaelin shifted between one heartbeat and the next, fur rippling into skin, muzzle shortening into a man's face. He stood before her completely bare, blood streaming from the gash across his shoulder and down his chest. His eyes found hers, wild with adrenaline and something fiercer. Hurt, his voice was rough, more growl than word. "My ankle." Seraphina tried to stand and nearly fell. "Kaelin, you're bleeding." He swept her up before she could finish. One arm behind her knees, the other supporting her back. The heat of his bare skin against her burned through her dress. She gasped, her hands finding purchase on his shoulders, feeling the play of muscle beneath scarred flesh, the rapid thunder of his heartbeat. Blood from his wound marked her dress. But she couldn't look away from his face. The fierce protectiveness there, the raw intensity of his gaze locked on hers. "Safe," he said, carrying her toward the cabin as though she weighed nothing. "Keep safe." Seraphina's arms circled his neck. Her body pressed against his. And for the first time since fleeing House Varus, she felt something other than alone. Inside the cabin, Kaelin set her down on the narrow bed with a gentleness that contradicted the violence she'd just witnessed. His hands, still stained with blood, his own and others, moved over her injured ankle with careful precision, testing for broken bones. His touch surprisingly knowing. "Not broken," he murmured, the words still halting. "Twisted, bad, but heal." "You know healing?" Seraphina gasped, as his fingers found a particularly tender spot. He nodded, then gestured to his scarred chest, his shoulder still bleeding sluggishly. The message was clear. He'd survived enough injuries to understand them. "Let me tend that wound first," she started, but he shook his head firmly. "You first." His ice-blue eyes held hers, brooking no argument. While he wrapped her ankle with strips of cloth torn from his gifted tunic, ruining it without hesitation, Seraphina became acutely aware of his nakedness. Not with shame or fear, but with an awareness that heated her skin from within. The firelight caught on the planes of his body, on scars that told stories of survival she could only imagine. "I need to change," she said quietly, gesturing to her blood-soaked dress. "My clothes." Kaelin moved to the far corner immediately, turning his back, but she caught the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his spine, as though giving her privacy required every ounce of his considerable control. Seraphina peeled off the ruined dress with shaking hands, the fabric stiff with dried blood and creek water. She pulled on her only other dress, rough homespun, but clean and dry, hyper-aware of the man mere feet away who was trying so hard not to look. "Done," she said softly. He turned, and the naked hunger in his eyes stole her breath. Not threatening, never that, but open, raw, wanting in a way that made her feel seen for the first time in her life. Not as Lady Seraphina, daughter of House Varus, political pawn, just as herself, as a woman. "The fire," she managed, pointing to the dying hearth. "It needs." But Kaelin was already moving, adding wood with careful placement, then reaching for the flint and steel she kept on the mantel. He struck them together clumsily, fascinated when sparks flew, like a child discovering magic. He tried again, his focus absolute, until tinder caught and flames began to grow. The contradiction captivated her, this creature who'd just torn through trained hunters with savage efficiency, now marveling at the simple miracle of making fire, who spoke in fragments like a child learning language, but whose eyes held the weight of something ancient and knowing. "Clever," Seraphina said, and his head snapped toward her, seeking approval like an offering. She patted the space beside her on the bed. "Your shoulder, let me." He approached slowly, sinking down with predatory grace. This close, she could smell him pine and winter air, and something wilder, something that made her pulse quicken. She cleaned the wound with water and precious whiskey, feeling the tremor that ran through his body when her fingers touched his skin. "This will hurt," she warned, threading her bone needle. "Hurt less, because you." The words came easier now, as though emotion loosened his tongue. She stitched carefully, and he didn't flinch once, just watched her face with that devastating intensity, as though memorizing every detail. "What should I call you?" Seraphina asked as she tied off the last stitch. "I can't keep thinking of you as the wolf." He struggled for a moment, then pressed his hand to his chest. "Kai. Kael." Frustration flickered across his features. "Kaelin," she offered gently. His eyes widened. "Kaelin," he repeated. testing it. Then, with absolute certainty, yes, Kalen. The gift of his name settled between them like a vow. Outside, wind howled and snow began to fall in earnest. Inside, warmth from the fire pushed back the dark. Kalen stretched out on the floor beside her bed, a guardian positioned between her and the door, between her and every threat the world might offer. For the first time in 3 months, Seraphina was not alone. And for the first time in her life, that didn't terrify her. Her ankle healed over the following week. And with it, the careful distance she'd maintained crumbled like frost in sunlight. Kalen came daily now, sometimes as wolf padding silently through morning mist, sometimes as man arriving at dusk with gifts that spoke of careful observation. Winter berries from the highest branches, the dark purple ones she'd mentioned liking. Smooth stones arranged on her windowsill in patterns that caught moonlight spirals and circles that reminded her of ancient symbols she'd seen in her father's oldest books. A fox pelt so impossibly soft she suspected he'd spent hours selecting the perfect one, knowing her blankets were threadbare. "How did you know?" she asked when he brought the berries, her fingers stained purple from eating them. Kalen touched his temple, then pointed to her. "Watch, listen, learn. You." Their conversations grew longer, his words coming easier as though her presence unlocked something dormant. She taught him to string sentences together, to express not just needs but thoughts, feelings, the complex language of a man rather than simple wolf communication. "The stars," he said one night, pointing through the window. "You look at them." Sad face. "Why?" "I used to study them with my father," Seraphina admitted. "Before he died, before I became." She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything she'd lost. "Property," Kalen supplied, the word sharp with understanding. His hand found hers in the darkness. "No more. Here, you are. Seraphina. Only Seraphina." The simplicity of it broke something open in her chest. On the 8th day, he arrived in wolf form with others. Seraphina watched from her doorway as they emerged from the trees, 6 wolves of varying sizes, moving with the coordinated grace of a unit that had hunted together for years. But it was their behavior that made her breath catch. Every wolf deferred to Kalen, not with fear, but with unmistakable respect. They waited for his signals, followed his lead, positioned themselves according to some hierarchy she could sense but not fully understand. And at the front, now nearly full-grown, was the pup she'd pulled from the flood. "Ash," Seraphina breathed, recognizing the amber eyes, the distinctive white patch on his chest. The young wolf yipped excitedly, breaking formation to bound toward her. A larger gray wolf, his mother, clearly followed more sedately, her amber eyes warm with something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Kalen shifted to human form, unconcerned by his nakedness before his pack. "Lyra," he said, gesturing to the gray wolf. "Ash's mother. She wants, thank you, for her son." Lyra approached and did something extraordinary. She bowed her head and touched her nose to Seraphina's hand, a gesture of submission and respect that sent chills down her spine. "What are you?" Seraphina asked Kalen quietly as the wolves settled around the clearing, watching them both. "They follow you like you're their Alpha," he supplied. Then, with careful pronunciation, "Pack needs Alpha. I am theirs." But there was something he wasn't saying. She could see it in the shadow that crossed his face. An Alpha? Yes. But why did he live apart? Why had he been alone? When she found Ash, that night, by firelight, Seraphina taught him to write his name. She guided his hand rough and scarred across precious paper, forming each letter slowly. Kalen. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked at her with wonder in his eyes. "This is me?" "This is you," she confirmed. He traced the letters reverently, then wrote below in painstaking script, Seraphina. You, he said, and me, together on paper. Their names side by side looked right in a way that made her heart ache, like a promise, like the beginning of something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The blizzard came 3 days later, violent and sudden, burying the world in white. Snow piled against the cabin door until even opening it became impossible. The wind screamed like something alive and furious, shaking the walls, finding every crack to send icy fingers through. Kaelin had been caught inside when it hit, and now they were trapped together in the small space that suddenly felt smaller still. He learned to read with a hunger that astonished her. Seraphina had never seen anyone consume knowledge the way Kaelin did, running his fingers under each word, sounding them out with fierce concentration, then reading entire passages back to her with growing confidence. Her father's books on stars, on healing herbs, even her mother's old poetry, he devoured them all. Beautiful, he said, looking up from a poem about winter. Words can be beautiful, not just useful. In return, he taught her the language of the forest. How to read the pitch of bird calls, alarm versus contentment versus mating songs. How to smell snow coming hours before it fell. The subtle hierarchy of pack structure, not just dominance, but care, duty. The complex web of relationships that kept wolves alive. Alpha protects, he explained, his hand covering hers. But pack also protects Alpha. Circle, not line. On the fourth night, as wind howled and firelight painted shadows across the walls, Seraphina noticed how long his hair had grown wild and tangled, falling past his shoulders. "Let me," she said, retrieving her small sewing scissors. "Your hair." Kaelin settled on the floor before her without hesitation, his back to the fire, his face tilted up toward hers. Trust, absolute and unquestioned. Seraphina combed her fingers through the dark strands, working out tangles with patient gentleness. She trimmed carefully, evening out the length, letting the cut pieces fall like dark snow around them. The intimacy of it overwhelmed her, the feel of his hair between her fingers, the warmth of his scalp, the way his eyes drifted closed with something like contentment. When she finished, Kaelin turned to face her, still on his knees, bringing them eye to eye. The firelight caught in his gaze, turning ice blue to molten gold. "Seraphina," he whispered, her name shaped like a prayer, like a confession. His hand rose slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers touched her face with trembling reverence, tracing her cheekbone, her jaw, the curve of her lower lip. "Kaelin," she breathed, and something broke between them. He kissed her like a man discovering fire for the first time, fierce and tender and desperate. She melted into him, her hands finding the warm skin of his shoulders, his back, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. His mouth moved over hers with increasing confidence, learning what made her gasp, what made her fingers dig into his flesh. "Want you," he murmured against her lips, the words coming easier now. "Want. Is this? Want. 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 Is this?" "Yes," Seraphina answered, drawing him down onto the furs beside the fire. "Yes." They came together slowly, carefully, a conversation conducted in touches and sighs rather than words. Kaelin worshipped her with hands that shook, with kisses pressed to every inch of skin she allowed him to discover. When he finally entered her, his eyes held hers, and Seraphina felt something shift fundamentally in her chest. This was choosing. This was freedom. Afterward, they lay tangled together, his body curled protectively around hers, their breathing slowly synchronizing. The language of the wolf and the woman had finally fused into something neither had words for. When dawn came, gray and muted through the storm, Seraphina woke to find Kaelin watching her with soft wonder, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. "Morning," he said, and smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. The cabin was no longer shelter, it had become sanctuary. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Seraphina woke each morning wrapped in Kaelin's warmth, his breath steady against her neck, his arm heavy across her waist. They moved through days as partners. He hunted while she tended traps. She taught reading while he showed her how to move silently through snow. At night, they came together with increasing confidence, learning the language of each other's bodies until pleasure became another form of conversation. But winter was unforgiving, and happiness didn't fill empty stomachs. The stores dwindled faster than Seraphina had calculated. 2 people, especially when one was a shifter with a wolf's appetite, consumed provisions at an alarming rate. The game had grown scarce, driven deep into the forest by cold and wolves and the hunters who'd never stopped searching. "I can hunt farther," Kaelin said, reading her worried expression as she rationed the last of the dried venison. 3 days out, 3 days back. Elk herds in the high country. Too dangerous. Seraphina touched the scar on his shoulder, now healed but still visible. "The hunters have silver weapons. If they catch you in the open, then I scout hunter patrols," he countered. "You hunt close. 2 days. No more. I watch. Keep you safe from distance." She hated the necessity of it, but survival left no room for sentiment. They couldn't both starve waiting for safety that might never come. The next morning, Kaelin left in wolf form, while Seraphina headed toward the eastern woods where she'd seen deer signs. Her bow felt awkward after weeks of disuse, her fingers clumsy on the string, but hunger was a powerful teacher, and by midday she'd tracked a young doe to a clearing near a frozen stream. She climbed a tree for a better angle, settling onto a thick branch to wait for the perfect shot. Voices carried across the winter air before she saw them. Seraphina froze, hardly breathing, as 6 men emerged from the trees on the opposite bank. All bore the Alpha King's insignia. All carried weapons that gleamed with silver. 3 months searching these cursed woods. A familiar voice growled. "Commander Thorn," his face still bearing bruises from Kaelin's attack. "She has to be here." "Perhaps the wolves got her," another suggested. "Would save us the trouble. The king wants her alive." This voice was older, measured. A gray-haired man with a tracker's careful gaze moved to examine prints in the snow. "Lady Seraphina of House Varus, the 8th. 8th claimed mate," Thorn clarified with cruel amusement. "All that power, and the Alpha King still can't keep a woman alive past a year. Tragic. Really." Seraphina's blood turned to ice. "Watch your tongue," the older man Corvin said quietly. "What we know and what we say are different things. The king's mates die in unfortunate accidents, childbirth complications, winter fevers. Always tragic, always convenient. 7 dead wives." Another hunter muttered. "This one won't last either, once she's served her purpose." House Varus's alliance secured, then another convenient tragedy. "This one's different though." Thorn spat into the snow. "This one ran. Made a fool of him in front of the court. He'll make her suffer before the accident happens." Corvin knelt to study tracks more closely, and Seraphina's heart stopped. Wolf prints, large ones, leading directly toward her territory. "There's a big male hunting these woods," Corvin said slowly. "Silver black coat, ice blue eyes. I've seen him before, years ago, before the old queen died." The way he said it carried weight, knowledge, history. "What difference does a wolf make?" Thorn demanded. "Every difference," Corvin replied, still studying the prints. "If I'm right about which wolf this is." He looked up, directly at the tree where Seraphina hid, and their eyes met across the distance. For one terrible moment, she thought he'd call out. Instead, Corvin stood and turned away. "Nothing here. Let's try the northern ridge." The hunters moved on, and Seraphina remained frozen in her perch, heart hammering as the truth settled like stones in her stomach. 7 dead wives. She would have been the 8th. Would have lasted a year at most before becoming another convenient tragedy. And somehow, Corvin knew about Kaelin. Seraphina remained in the tree long after the hunters disappeared, her limbs trembling with more than cold. When she finally climbed down, her legs nearly gave out beneath her. 7 dead wives. The words echoed in her skull like a death knell. She was gathering her bow when the screaming started. The hunters had circled back, and they'd found Kaelin. Seraphina ran toward the sounds of combat, crashing through underbrush, her heart a hammer against her ribs. She burst into a clearing to see chaos, wolves and men locked in violent collision. Ash darted between legs, snapping at ankles. Lyra had a hunter pinned, her jaws around his throat. And at the center, Kaelin, in wolf form, magnificent and terrible, tearing through the hunters with surgical precision. Corvin stood at the edge of the melee, silver blade drawn but not engaging. His eyes tracked Kaelin with something like recognition, something like sorrow. "I spared the wolf prince once long ago," he murmured. So quietly Seraphina almost missed it. Won't kill him now. But Commander Thorn had no such mercy. While Kaelin savaged another hunter, Thorn moved behind him, silver blade gleaming with unnatural light. Enchanted. Deadly. Kaelin. Seraphina's scream came too late. Thorn drove the blade between Kaelin's ribs, burying it to the hilt. Kaelin's howl split the winter air. He spun, even with silver in his chest, and his jaws closed around Thorn's throat. The commander died gurgling, but the damage was done. Kaelin collapsed. The remaining hunters fled, Corvin herding them away with urgent commands. The wolves circled their fallen alpha, whining, but Seraphina pushed through them. "No," she breathed, dropping to her knees beside Kaelin. He'd already shifted to human form, his body's instinctive response to mortal injury. The silver blade protruded from his chest, and around it, black veins spread like cracks in ice poison corrupting flesh. "Seraphina," he gasped, his hand finding hers. "Run. Leave me." "Not." "Shut up." She gripped the blade's hilt, her hands shaking. "This will hurt." She pulled. Kaelin screamed, his back arching, but the blade came free in a gush of blood that smelled wrong, metallic and rotting. The black veins spread faster now, crawling up his chest toward his heart. Seraphina dragged him. Through snow, through forest, her muscles screaming, refusing to let him die on frozen ground like prey. Ash and Lyra flanked them, helping bear his weight, until finally the cabin appeared through the trees. 4 days. 4 days, she fought death for him. She removed his blood-soaked clothes with shaking hands, packed the wound with yarrow and golden seal, trying to draw out poison that sank deeper with every hour. The black veins spread across his chest, down his arms, creeping toward his heart like fingers of corruption. Kaelin burned with fever, then shook with chills. He thrashed, delirious, calling for someone named Elara, his mother. Perhaps. Seraphina held him through it all, dripping water between his cracked lips, changing blood-soaked bandages, refusing to sleep. "You will not leave me," she whispered fiercely against his burning forehead. "Do you hear me, Kaelin? You will not leave me." On the 4th day, when the black veins nearly reached his heart, Seraphina remembered. The star bloom, still preserved in water on her shelf, its luminescence dimmed but not dead. She'd read about its healing properties in her father's books, powerful, rare, said to cure poisons that would kill even shifters. With trembling hands, she crushed the petals into paste and spread it directly over the wound. The effect was immediate. The star bloom's pale light flared bright, then brighter, until Seraphina had to look away. When she looked back, the black veins were receding slowly at first, Then faster, the corruption dissolving like frost under sunlight. Kaelin's eyes opened, ice blue and clear, and focused on her face. "Seraphina," he breathed, his hand lifting to touch her tear-stained cheek. "You saved me." "You gave me the flower," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved yourself." He pulled her down beside him, and she went, pressing her face against his neck, feeling the steady beat of his pulse beneath her lips. "Elara," he murmured into her hair, "was my mother's name. She was Queen." And Seraphina understood, finally, what Corvin had meant by Wolf Prince. Kaelin slept for 20 hours straight, his body finally surrendering to the healing it desperately needed. Seraphina kept vigil, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, tracing the fading black lines that marked where death had nearly claimed him. When he woke, his eyes were haunted. "My mother," he said, his voice rough from disuse and fever dreams. "Elara, she was beautiful, strong. The northern packs, they followed her because they loved her, not because they feared." Seraphina brought him water, broth, helped him sit upright against the wall. "Tell me." The story came in fragments, memories surfacing through layers of trauma and years of forced forgetting. Elara, the Wolf Queen who'd ruled the northern territories with wisdom and fierce protection. Draeven, the ambitious southern alpha who'd courted her with promises of alliance, of united packs stronger than any had been before. "He loved her," Kaelin said, staring at nothing. "I remember. He loved her. At first. Then he wanted what she had, more than who she was." The claiming ceremony had been grand. The birth of their son, Kaelin, had been celebrated across all territories. For 5 years, the united packs had thrived. Then Elara had challenged Draeven's decision to exile a rival pack rather than absorb them. She'd called it cruelty, unnecessary. She'd stood before the council and questioned his judgment. "He killed her that night," Kaelin whispered. "Made it look like accident, hunting gone wrong. I was 5, old enough to remember her screams, old enough to know." Kaelin, Seraphina's hand found his, gripping tight. "He took me into the forest himself." His voice had gone flat, distant. "His own son. Told me I was weak like my mother, that the wild would make me strong or kill me. Either outcome was acceptable." Left to die at 5 years old, raised by wolves who took pity on a broken child, learning to shift, to hunt, to survive, but never fully recovering the language he'd lost, the humanity that had been stolen. "I tried to speak for years," Kaelin continued. "The words were in my head, but my mouth forgot how. The wolves, they don't need words. They understand. Without them, it was easier to stop trying. Until Seraphina, until she'd looked at him like he was more than beast, more than broken thing, until she'd taught him that words could be gifts instead of weapons." "The medallion," Seraphina said suddenly, remembering the silver disc he always wore. "May I?" Kaelin lifted it over his head with trembling hands. The metal was old, finely crafted, bearing a crest Seraphina recognized from her studies, the royal seal of the United Packs. On the back, an inscription, "Elara's son, the true heir." "She gave it to me the morning she died," Kaelin said. "Told me to keep it safe, to remember who I was." The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Draeven had spent 20 years consolidating power, eliminating threats, murdering wives who challenged him or outlived their usefulness. 7 dead women who'd been claimed and discarded like pawns. And now his exiled son, the true heir who'd survived against all odds, had fallen in love with the 8th woman Draeven intended to claim and kill. "We're both running from the same monster," Seraphina breathed. "He'll never stop hunting you," Kaelin said. "Political alliance with House Varys, he needs it. And if he discovers I'm alive," his hand tightened around hers, "he'll send armies, not hunters, armies. Then we can't stay here." "No." Kaelin's eyes met hers, clear and determined, despite his weakness. We run, deep into the wild lands, beyond his reach, beyond any reach. Together, Seraphina said, not a question. Together. He pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. I choose you. Freely. Not claiming. Not duty. Choice. Outside, wolves howled a warning carried on winter wind. Lyra appeared at the window, her eyes urgent. More hunters were coming, and they were out of time. They left before dawn, when the world was still caught between night and morning, between one life and another. Kaelin moved slower than usual, his body still healing, but determination burned in every step. He'd shifted to wolf form to conserve strength, his silver-black fur ghostly in the pre-dawn grey. Seraphina kept pace beside him, carrying only what mattered, her father's knife, the medallion, a small pack of dried meat, and the few precious herbs that remained. Everything else, the cabin, her past, the ghost of Lady Seraphina of House Varus, she left behind, without looking back. Ash ranged ahead, his adolescent energy boundless despite the danger. Lyra moved like smoke through the trees, scouting, circling back to report with soft chuffs and meaningful glances. The pack had chosen to follow their alpha into exile, into freedom. They climbed through deep snow, following game trails that led away from everything Draeven controlled, away from courts and claiming ceremonies and the weight of names that felt like chains. The thornwood grew wilder here, older, the trees so ancient their roots remembered a time before kings and territories. As the sun crested the eastern ridge, painting snow gold and pink, they reached the boundary. Seraphina felt it like a physical thing, the edge of Draeven's reach, the place where his hunters wouldn't follow. The wild lands beyond answered to no alpha, belonged to no one. Kaelin shifted to human form, uncaring of the cold against his bare skin. His hand found hers, fingers lacing together with the easy familiarity of lovers who'd already weathered storms. Last chance, he said quietly, his voice still rough but growing stronger. Turn back now. You might survive. Claim you were taken, held captive. They might believe. No. Seraphina turned to face him fully, her free hand rising to cup his scarred cheek. I didn't survive 3 months alone just to go back to being property. I choose this. I choose you. Something fierce and tender blazed in his ice-blue eyes. I choose you too. Have chosen you since the moment you stepped into freezing water to save a drowning pup. Saved by compassion, saved by love, saving each other in all the ways that mattered. No formal claiming ceremony was needed to make true what already existed between them, something both wild and tender, ancient and new. Their bond had been forged in survival and sealed in trust, written in the language of gifts exchanged and wounds healed and bodies intertwined. Words had been the bridge, but what they'd built transcended language entirely. Ash bounded up the ridge ahead of them, barking excitedly at something only he could see. Lyra huffed, amused, and trotted after her exuberant son. The message was clear. The wild lands are vast. Let's explore them. Kaelin's hand tightened around Seraphina's. Ready? She looked at the untamed wilderness, stretching before them, dangerous, unknown, and utterly free. Then she looked at the man beside her, the wolf prince who'd learned to speak again for her, who'd nearly died protecting her, who'd chosen her as fiercely as she'd chosen him. Ready, she said. They crested the ridge together and descended into legend. Behind them, the cabin would stand empty until hunters found it, until stories began to circulate. The lady who'd vanished, the wolf prince who'd survived exile. Some would say she'd been killed by beasts. Others would whisper of shapeshifters and forbidden love. Of a woman who'd chosen wilderness over crown, who'd saved a wolf pup and earned a prince's devotion. The truth was simpler and more profound. Two souls fleeing the same monster had found each other in the spaces between words and built something neither had dared hope for. Not claiming, but choosing. Not possession, but partnership. Not fate, but freedom. The forest closed around them like a promise, and they disappeared into the wild, together, woman and wolf, healer and hunter, two hearts beating as one. Somewhere behind them, Alpha King Draeven's hunters would search. Somewhere ahead, new challenges awaited. But here, in this moment, crossing the threshold into their chosen future, Seraphina and Kaelin were exactly what they'd never been before. Free. They chose freedom over safety, love over duty, the wild over the crown. If you had to choose between a safe life of obligation or a dangerous life of freedom with someone you love, which would you pick? Let me know in the comments and subscribe, because Seraphina and Kaelin's adventures in the Untamed Lands are just beginning. Tell me what you'd like to see happen next in their journey.